Hello everyone and welcome to Smart World with CNBC. Bonjour à tous et bienvenue dans Smart World avec CNBC, votre émission 100% bilingue en anglais et en français. We are together to have another view of the greatest business moments of CNBC. At the top of this program, injection de 500 millions de dollars dans le projet de vaccin AstraZeneca, nouvelle offre de stimulus de Donald Trump et les pourparlers entre AMD et Xilinx. C'est parti, let's go! AstraZeneca surges, le département de la santé injecte 500 millions de dollars dans le développement du traitement AstraZeneca. A COVID-19 antibody treatment, the HHS will provide $500 million for the company to produce and manufacture these treatments.
Check out shares of AstraZeneca moving higher this hour on a Reuters report saying its antibody combination is moving into phase 3 clinical trials. The report also says that HHS will provide nearly $500 million to AstraZeneca for those trials and for large-scale manufacturing. So good to see there are more producers here of these monoclonal antibodies, which are taking center stage in the fight against COVID-19.
Les actions d'AstraZeneca grimpent après cette annonce. Son traitement anticorps passe désormais en phase 3 des essais cliniques. Donald Trump raises stimulus offer to $1.8 trillion. This is about $400 billion less than the $2.2 trillion bill Democrats previously passed.
To offer Democrats a $1.8 trillion coronavirus relief package that is up from their previous offer of $1.6 trillion. And it comes after the president tweeted just a little bit ago, negotiators go big. So that offer is what the Treasury Secretary will present to the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, when they talk over the phone later on this afternoon. There is still a question, though, over how long it would take to get a deal done, even if Democrats do agree to this number. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell was just saying earlier today in Kentucky that he thinks it's unlikely an agreement could be reached by the time of the election. But we now know that the White House will be increasing their offer to $1.8 trillion. Scott.
And Elon, the Democrats have been where, 2.2?
$2.2 trillion. And it also seems unlikely that Pelosi would be able to pass anything in her caucus that is below $2 trillion. So we'll see if they can come to some sort of agreement on the top line. And also remember, it's not just the overall number, it's also the details of the language as well. Pelosi has said that she wants to ensure that she's not giving the administration a blank check. So there is still a lot of fine-tuning to go, even if a top-line number is agreed to. But what we are seeing now is the two sides coming closer together after we had thought that a deal was completely off the table just days ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it used to be one side's at 1.8, one side's at 2.2. Maybe you go to 2. I don't know. We'll see where this one goes. Elon, thanks for the update.
Une augmentation par rapport aux 1,6 milliard de dollars précédemment proposés par l'administration Trump. Pour adopter un projet de loi avant les élections, les deux partis doivent à la fois parvenir à un accord et obtenir le soutien du Sénat, majoritairement républicain. La valeur des actions des entreprises qui commercialisent du cannabis augmente à l'approche des élections. Voters in Arizona, Montana, New Jersey and South Dakota will decide whether to legalize and tax recreational marijuana in November. Mississippi residents will get to consider legalizing cannabis for medical purposes. More details from CNBC.
Criminalization would look most similar to some proposed legislation that's already sitting with Congress called the States Act. What that essentially does is push the rulemaking down to the state level. As we envision it, if the Democrats do take the Senate and the White House in the upcoming election, we think that's the highest probability pathway to incremental terms of candidates in the United States. Not allow for is interstate commerce. The States Act or decriminalization would also not allow for the Canadians to enter the U.S. marketplace. The international operators would require full legalization in order to access the U.S. market.
These stocks obviously have a long ways to go to get back to their highs. The names that you like include Green Thumb and Cresco. And there are states like New Jersey, my home state, where there, I believe, is some form of legalization or decriminalization on the ballot this year. So even absent a blue wave, is the state-by-state effort enough to be a reason to own some of these stocks?
For the U.S. operators, absolutely. We've been doing a election catalyst series in conjunction with my colleagues on the policy side at Cowen, and the first piece of analysis we did was exactly that. We think that there's a very good possibility that both New Jersey and Arizona, by ballot initiatives, will legalize cannabis for adult use. We think by 2025, that's an incremental $3 billion to our total market estimate. So that gets us from 31 to 34 billion. On top of which, we think there are some state legislatures that can also legalize cannabis for adult use. New York is very high on our list on that one. You know, Governor Cuomo has spoken to it. He's committed to it. COVID was obviously a distraction, but we do think that the state assembly is going to move forward there. We think there's a pretty good possibility that Connecticut and Rhode Island move forward as well. And lastly, while Pennsylvania doesn't have a Republican-controlled state assembly, their Democratic Governor Tom Wolf has been quite supportive. If you get those next four states, that's an incremental $6 billion by 2025. So really just two ballot initiatives and four state legislatures takes our estimate from 31 billion to 40 billion.
À ce jour, 33 États ont légalisé la consommation de cannabis médical, dont 11 l'ont légalisé à des fins récréatives. La légalisation dans de nouveaux États pourrait être une aide importante pour les États et les villes durement touchés par la pandémie. Les ventes potentielles de cannabis représentent de nouvelles recettes fiscales pour ces États. And the big banks, a cohort that includes Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, and Chase and Bank of America, will report third quarter results this week. Les bénéfices devraient baisser par rapport à l'année dernière. BNP Paribas US CEO discusses economic recovery.
Are you seeing a lot more M&A and a lot more in the pipeline at the moment?
You mean in the tech industry or in the banking industry?
Broadly, no, as in terms of your clients across all sectors.
Well, it's really sector-driven, and it really depends on, and it will depend on how the pandemic evolves, really. Obviously, in the sectors that have benefited from this pandemic, and you named, one of them, but it's not limited to this one, we might continue to see some activity there. I think to see a more robust trend in M&A, it's really going to be depending on how fast the recovery takes place in 2021.
In terms of recovery, as we look at the U.S. economy, how reliant do you think it is on fiscal stimulus coming in the next couple of weeks or months?
Well, for sure, I think there is no debate, by the way, in the United States, and it's a similar dialogue in Europe, that there is going to be a need for more fiscal support. We have still a lot of uncertainties. Well, you mentioned the U.S. elections here, but we have an ailing economy. We still have no vaccine, and it's going to have to be widely distributed. Then fiscal support will have to take place. The real question is how deep, how broad, and it's all going to be depending as well on how long the pandemic lasts and how fast we can distribute and develop the vaccine.
What are you seeing in the U.S. economy, in the loans, in small businesses and lenders? We're 3% off a record high for the S&P 500. Does that match up with what you're seeing?
Well, I think we've seen, and at BNP Paribas, we've been very active supporting our clients worldwide and in the United States. You have two types of corporates. You have the larger one, the listed one, who really have access to capital markets. And it's been quite easy or functional for them to access capital markets, to do capital raising or to do liability management. As you highlight, Sarah, well, the smaller enterprises, mid-caps, have been more challenged because they don't have this access. And this is where the banking industry had to play a role, extending lending. By the way, participating to some of the government programs. At BNP Paribas in the US, we've been very active in participating to the Paycheck Protection Program, supporting these smaller enterprises. We processed, 18,000 applications, converting into $4 billion of lending. We probably supported and protected 500,000 jobs doing so. Then that's the way the smaller enterprise have been supported here.
Jean-Yves, clearly the Fed has said recently that it expects to keep rates very low for quite some time. With your knowledge of how European banks have had to endure incredibly low rates, even negative rates in Europe for the last decade or so, are you fearful that margins will be pressured in the US for banks for the next 5-10 years?
Well, it's clear that a low rate environment for banks is not the most favorable environment as it relates to BNP Paribas. Being European based, we've been very used to navigating not only low rates but negative interest rates for many years, and we're pretty well equipped. Another mitigant for banks, vis-a-vis the rate environment, is really being diversified and having a diversified business model in terms of activities, but in terms of geographies, and that is something that has really helped us develop and grow activities sustainably and profitably.
Les taux d'intérêt bas devraient rester au plus bas niveau. Le PDG de BNP Paribas USA voit de plus en plus de fusions et acquisitions en temps de pandémie, surtout dans le secteur de la tech. Mais pour une reprise plus robuste, il faudra attendre 2021, dit-il. AMD is in talks to buy chipmaker Xilinx, a deal that could be valued at more than $30 billion. Selon le Wall Street Journal, l'accord pourrait voir le jour d'ici la semaine prochaine. On écoute.
So do you think this will be a smart acquisition?
Yes, it is. It's very smart. AMD was on a surge after Intel tripped on last quarter, and they've done very well with the new products. Their stock is up significantly, so this is a perfect time to use that currency to acquire Xilinx, which gives them a much bigger footprint in the cloud, and the cloud is where you want to be. Every semiconductor company shipping into the cloud right now is doing quite well, so it's a smart move on their part.
It's also just the latest in a string of very big semiconductor deals this year. So NVIDIA is trying to buy ARM for $40 billion. We saw Analog Devices and Maxim. Ed, we're assuming these go through from a regulatory perspective. Where does this leave the U.S. semiconductor industry? What does it look like? How different is it by the end of the year?
Well, I mean, consolidation is almost inevitable at this point. And even before COVID, growth was slowing in all these areas, from even some of the smaller companies. And when that starts to happen, they accumulate a lot more cash. And when you get more cash, then you look at M&A. It actually puts the U.S. in a pretty good position. Semiconductor-wise. One, we lead the world in almost all these technologies. Secondly, as soon as in smart consolidations like this, the company being acquired, in this case Xilinx, is going to have a lot more resources and a lot more access to markets they may not be able to address by themselves. So, there are always the goofball M&A acquisitions. You can look at Intel for several of those in the last 10 years. But generally speaking, if you do something like this, and the ones that have been announced all make logical sense, and the markets, I think, will get stronger, and the U.S. position will get stronger over time.
So, Ed, is anyone suggesting that we're kind of marking the top for the sector, given that there has been so much M&A?
No, actually, I think you're going to see a big surge in the semiconductor sector over the next probably 4 quarters or so. If you recall, we started the down cycle in semis late 18 or so. You saw it from everybody, from TI, from Avago, from just about everybody who wasn't super focused right in the cloud. And that was normally going to end about the beginning of this year. You saw signs that it was starting to turn, and then COVID hit. And that kind of confused everything, pushed out orders, et cetera. So now what you're seeing, and we've gotten 4 or 5 pre-announcements, significant upside pre-announcements this quarter already, that semis demand is very strong in cloud, it's very strong in audio, and so everybody's surprised. And NXP said this, Qorvo said this the other day, that you're seeing a big surge in retail or phones because of Apple and what's happening with Huawei. So you're actually probably in the first stages of a semiconductor rebound that'll push it in next year.
Yeah, I think what other investors are trying to figure out, broader investors, Ed, is whether that is a cyclical tell for the economy. The fact that semis have been in such a good leadership position here, there's M&A, which is a sign of confidence. There are some interesting tailwinds, or whether this is industry specific around things like 5G. How do you answer that?
No, I think it's wider than that, because if you look at the specifics of the upside reports, especially out of companies like Broadcom and even Qualcomm and AMD, there are a lot to do with the cloud. Obviously, as people have to social distance and you have to stay at home and use Zoom, et cetera, you're going to see a lot more access to the cloud. We've definitely seen that. But you're also seeing industrial demand starting to pick up. You're seeing the cloud service providers pull more networking equipment through. And then wireless, 5G is driving a big upside demand in the RF names, actually in the baseband names too. So you've got several different factors that are driving upside. It's not, I don't think, one sector specific. And you're going to see that when TI reports next week. Very, very broad product line. That's a kind of a harbinger of what's going to happen in the next quarters. I think that's going to be a good report too.
Josh, are any of the analyst community talking about likely takeover targets that are left?
You know, I mean, listen, the M&A in the semis, Wolf, is nothing new. We've seen that for a while. It does seem to be heating up, and that's no surprise given the environment we're seeing, interest rates and valuation. One thing I would just go back to quickly is I think you can certainly understand the strategic fit of this move. AMD is trying to expand their product portfolio. They are well known for what is known as CPUs and GPUs. If they do acquire Xilinx, you move into FPGAs too. Those are very efficient, easily reprogrammable microchips that are in a lot of hot end markets, right? So 5G, but also auto, industrial. So you can understand why AMD would be making the move. The stock did finish down today, though, and I think that's because some investors might flag some potential risks here. There's execution risk. This is a big acquisition for AMD's executive team. It's a new muscle they would have to work, and also regulatory risk. You wouldn't necessarily think of regulatory risk here with AMD and Xilinx, but it is a different kind of world we're trying to get through here. Obviously, U.S.-China tensions running very hot. Some think are only going to get hotter. That'll be interesting to see how that plays here.
Anybody left, Ed, to buy?
There's always somebody left to buy. Yes, as a matter of fact. And Broadcom, which is one of the biggest acquisition hungry companies, biggest M&A companies out there, period. Last quarter, CEO Hock Tan basically said they're going to be back in the market next year buying software, mainframe software companies. So you're going to see quite a few more of these, I think, before the semiconductor cycle cools off, probably late 2021.
Ed Snyder, cofondateur et directeur général de Charter Equity, dit qu'il s'agit d'une consolidation intelligente pour l'industrie plus large des semi-conducteurs. En raison de la pandémie mondiale et de l'augmentation du télétravail, AMD a récemment constaté une utilisation accrue de ses produits. Euronext CEO on $5 billion deal to buy Borsa Italiana from LSE. The London Stock Exchange agreed to sell Milan's Borsa Italiana stock exchange to Euronext for 4.3 billion euros. Euronext CEO Stéphane Boujnah was live on CNBC.
Well, this is a transaction which we wanted to do because it's a very natural transaction. It's a transaction where that is an excellent fit with the purpose of Euronext. The purpose of Euronext is its mission is to be the backbone of the capital market union, is to be the place where we power pan-European capital markets to finance the real economy. So welcoming the market infrastructure of the third largest economy in Europe, welcoming a G7 country within Euronext was something very natural. So the way it will work is quite simple. After this transaction is completed, Italy will contribute approximately 1/3 of the top line of the revenues of Euronext. So Italy will be the largest contributor to the Euronext group. When you are the largest contributor of any company, are very important. And there is no success of Euronext going forward without the success of Borsa Italiana. And these are just fact. Borsa Italiana will not be a periphery asset in a large group. Borsa Italiana will be the largest asset within Euronext. And there are many consequences deriving from that reality. The first is that we will onboard a team that not only contributes a very successful exchange, a very successful Borsa stricto sensu, but also other assets that will be very critical for the rest of the group. CC&G, a very strong clearinghouse, Monte Titoli, a very large central depository, MTS, a fantastic success story in fixed income trading, especially in the govies, and Elite, which is a very impressive program to make SMEs closer to the stock exchange. So we are extremely excited about the prospects of completing this deal if and when the condition precedents are lifted.
Stéphane Bougenard affirme que la bourse italienne est un ajustement parfait pour le groupe. PDG et président d'Euronext qualifie l'opération de réalisation significative dans le plan stratégique de la société et un tournant dans l'histoire du groupe. Apple's 5G iPhones could drive users to switch carriers for faster service. Certains rivaux d'Apple ont déjà produit les modèles 5G et la Chine est pour l'instant bien en avance sur les États-Unis en ce qui concerne les réseaux de nouvelle génération. Aux États-Unis, la 5G ne sera pas proposée sur tous les réseaux téléphoniques.
Will Apple's coming 5G iPhone be a tipping point for telcos? Julia Borston looks at that. Julia.
Well, John, Apple's first 5G phones could spark an upgrade cycle to new phones, which could drive people to switch carriers for faster service, to stream more video and use more connected devices. Now, that could impact the telcos. AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile, they've invested billions of dollars in upgrading their systems. Now, here's how they stack up, according to New Street and OpenSignal Research. Now, they say that Verizon has the fastest speeds, around 500 megabits per second, but that's only available in 36 cities, a tiny percent of the country, with between 50 and 60 MBS available everywhere else. Now, T-Mobile, benefiting from its merger with Sprint, is next fastest with about 300 megabits per second speed in about a third of the country this year, with that same 50 to 60 Mbps elsewhere. And AT&T doesn't have those hyper-fast speeds, but its 60 Mbps is available nationwide. New Street Research's Jonathan Chaplin tells us, quote, it will take years for AT&T and Verizon to close the network performance gap with T-Mobile, at least 2 years and maybe 4. That is a long time in wireless land. Now, T-Mobile shares are up 48% year to date, while Verizon shares are down 4%, and AT&T, which has been weighed down by its Warner Media business, is down some 27% year to date. It's also worth pointing out there's some tech companies that have benefited from the investment in 5G, such as the chip makers Qualcomm and AMD, as well as infrastructure company American Tower.
Les Américains habitant en milieu rural pourraient devoir changer d'opérateur pour recevoir la 5G. T-Mobile a finalisé son acquisition de Sprint au début du mois d'avril, ce qui a donné à la société une grande empreinte 5G. Le réseau national 5G de T-Mobile a été mis en service en décembre. Son réseau couvre plus de 200 millions de personnes. The pandemic definitely changed the landscape for e-sport, but as all sports were on pause, many turned to their computers. Le succès de l'e-sport ne pâlit pas avec la pandémie de la Covid-19. Les détails de Juliana Tattelbaum de CNBC.
Despite an increase in viewers since the pandemic, e-sport has still faced challenges. ESL, which runs lucrative tournaments around the world, normally sells out arenas. But like other sports, they've had to rethink their strategy. How were ESL's tournaments affected by the pandemic?
It's a traveling circuit. We go to Australia, we have an event. We go to New York, we have an event, etc., etc. So the pandemic has greatly restricted travel and in general in-person competition. So in March, we had to cancel all our audience shows. We had the entire arena and we played out the games in an empty arena. We then had to switch our competition entirely from in person on a local computer network to online.
All the tournaments are streamed online now. How have viewing figures fared?
Our first event that was affected broke all of our viewership records. The grand final had over 1 million peak concurrent viewers tuning in, simply because people decided to stay home. All sports was on pause. Right now, as the restrictions have kind of eased up, it kind of normalized back to the trends that we were seeing before the pandemic.
And just looking overall, now that we're a few months into the pandemic, do you think the challenges of the pandemic mean that more mainstream sports and teams will turn to esports?
To some degree, yes. In a way, Manchester City has a FIFA player. It's kind of a natural extension. But for the most part, they earn millions and big millions revenues that I would still dream of, of seeing in esports because we're still smaller than a global sport like soccer on NBA, NFL. They still have to operate their sport to make money. And if they wanted to suddenly switch and do what we did, we'd probably kick their butts.
Clubs from football's most watched leagues already have their own professional gamers who represent and even wear team colors in FIFA esports tournaments, which are streamed on platforms such as Twitch. Ryan Pessoa is Manchester City's official esports player.
2020 has seen so many sporting events canceled or postponed. However, esports have fared relatively well, with a lot of mainstream sports turning to esports as an alternative. What have you made of the adoption of esports by mainstream sports?
I think it's a great thing, especially for esports. I wouldn't say that esports should be like a direct replacement from actual sport. I feel like it should go hand in hand with each other. Having the likes of esports tournaments that are being televised on mainstream media is always going to be beneficial for both, not just esports, for actual sport as well.
Have you seen an increase in fans over the last few months?
I'd say so, yeah, definitely in streaming. There's a lot of people that would come into my streams, for instance, and say they're not usually a gamer, or when they do play, it's kind of sporadically, but because they do have a lot more free time being at home, they can gain into the esport.
L'industrie du jeu vidéo dans son ensemble génère plus de revenus que les films et la musique réunis, un total de 120 milliards de dollars. La pandémie a d'ailleurs contraint la Formule 1 à lancer une nouvelle série de grands prix virtuels F1 e-sport, mettant en vedette un certain nombre de pilotes F1 actuels. Thank you all for being with us. Merci à tous d'avoir participé à ce format 100% hybride. See you very soon for the rest of international news.